Awesome.
Okay, well, we're ready to get started. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to the next presentation in our online conference series of weekly talks entitled The Case for Open Borders. We are really pleased and honored to have Ben Powell tonight. Let me give you some rundown on Ben. He's the director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University, professor of economics there at the Jerry S. Rawls College of Business Administration. He's written widely on this subject of immigration. He's the author, editor, or co-editor of several books, including on immigration. His research findings have been reported in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and other publications. He has more than 75 peer-reviewed scholarly articles and policy studies. His popular writing has appeared in the Chicago Tribune, New York Post, Dallas Morning News, and many other outlets. He's appeared on numerous radio, podcasts, television programs, including Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, and Showtime. He was a regular guest commentator on Fox Business Network's Freedom Watch and Stossel. He teaches an undergraduate course on global business economics and policy and a graduate course in Austrian economics. Ben, it is a real honor and a pleasure to have you participating in this conference, our series of talks. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspectives with us, and take it away.
Jacob, thanks so much. Always great to interact with you and Future Freedom Foundation. I think we've done this once or twice before on other topics, and I'm pleased to be doing this one with you. So I know you've had a whole series of talks on this Open Borders series, and I'll try to be a little bit different of what came before if some of you are frequent people tuning into this. So I'm going to focus mostly on what I think is the most important objection to mass immigration, let's say, or open borders. And I guess I'll spend just a moment on the phrase, because frankly, actually, I don't like, you should be able to see my PowerPoints now in addition to me. I'm not a big fan of using the phrase open borders because it carries a lot of baggage of what different people want to interpret that to mean, whether it's the chaos on the southern border in the current political climate, or people imagining it just means willy-nilly jumping across the Rio Grande wherever you want. So I tend to use the phrase of what I defend as Ellis Island immigration, at least in the context of nation states. Many of you hardcore anarcho-capital libertarians watching, if you want to push me on Q&A on other frameworks, that's fine. But in the context of having a government, thinking about immigration as Ellis Island immigration means going back to a system where we did not have quantitative restrictions for the most part on any country or nationality, Chinese Exclusion Act accepted. It allowing anybody in any number into the country, as long as you came through a legal checkpoint, and if you want to do some screening on serious criminality, known terrorists, or quarantine for disease until you come in, well, that's fine. But what I'm talking about is not the type of quantitative restrictions that the United States and virtually every other developed country in the world has now. And instead moving back to something that looks much more like the United States immigration policy of the 19th century. And it's no accident then that the book that I wrote on this topic has that image on the cover that you see there and uses the phrase wretched refuse, the political economy of immigration and institutions. So you've heard a lot, if you've been in this series before, about various arguments in favor of mass immigration. Excuse me if I puff on this cigar occasionally. I'm not as talented as like Ron White to use it for dramatic effect. But this is, when I'm doing a Zoom, one of the advantages. I can do it from my home basement where this is not only legal, but it's also fun. So you've heard a number of talks about immigration and various economic benefits it brings to the native population, to the people who move, and various problems that are associated with it. I'll say only briefly that some of immigration is just a different way to do international trade. It allows us to take advantage of comparative advantage between people on things that can't be traded across borders. I live in Texas, but you know what? I cannot even in Texas outsource childcare to India via a Zoom like this. If the person who has a comparative advantage in watching my child happens to reside in India, they need to be able to move to the United States to provide that service. Similarly, I can't outsource my lawn care to Mexico. There's certain services that must be provided on site, and if the labor that has a comparative advantage in doing it is located in a different country, they need to be able to move where the service is needed in order to take advantage of the standard gains from trade that we get in international trade. In that way, that part of the economics of immigration is very similar to the economics of international trade. But there's an additional economic benefit that's massive when it comes to immigration compared to trade in goods and services. And this is the place premium. And this is because much of humanity is trapped in countries around the world that have, frankly, crappy governance, that you have a risk of expropriation of your property, inflation of your profits, corruption, regulatory chaos, things that make it very hard to make use of whatever human capital you have on that place on earth. If you're listening to this lecture from the United States or a developed country, imagine or you don't have to imagine, know what you earn right now and how productive you are. Imagine we picked you up and dropped you in Haiti. Think about how productive you'd be able to be in Haiti. It's not that your human capital changed, it's the environment that you operate in makes it very difficult to create wealth and well-being for others, which means your own productivity and income goes down. Well, this is the case of literally billions of people around the world, both high-skilled and low-skilled. So we call this the place premium, the amount you earn based on being able to be more productive somewhere else. So one study about this by economists Lant Pritchett and others looked at 42 countries that cover about 1.5 billion people and the place premium of them moving to the United States. Average gain was close to $14,000. When people are free to move, you don't see wage differentials bigger than about 1.5. Within this study, the median country, the difference then in the United States was close to 4. This, by the way, means when people say the United States has an open border, of course it doesn't. Otherwise, we would not have, one, a wage differential that big between developing countries and us, and two, people wouldn't pay coyotes thousands of dollars to try to smuggle them across the border. They would simply walk across. So we don't have an open border. We have extremely restricted, albeit with a weird filter, immigration in the United States. So I'm sure this has come up multiple times in this lecture series, that when you estimate the gains of moving, allowing people to move from low productivity to high productivity places, the gains are absolutely massive. So somewhere between 67 and 150% of global output of going from a system of what we have today to unrestricted migration. Now, take somewhere in the middle of this, we're calling it doubling of global income. Now, this doesn't mean there's not problems that will be associated with mass migration if that were allowed. There's tons of problems. Observed inequality would increase, crowding in slums in the short run would. There's lots of different things we could talk about. And I'm sure people have talked about fiscal effects and all this. But if we're talking about a doubling of global income, you have to be thoroughly uncreative to not come up with ways to do what my friend Brian Kaplan calls keyhole solutions, where you allow migration and use some of the massive gains from it in order to address the problems that come. What I'm going to address tonight is what I think is the biggest objection to large-scale mass migration. And it's the objection that calls into question whether there really are trillion-dollar bills on the side. Big, massive gains to be had from unrestricted migration. Apologies for this wordy PowerPoint. This is what my friend Peter Betke does all the time. We call them power paragraphs in his case. So let me give this new economic case for immigration restrictions kind of briefly. And then what I'm going to do is argue against it for the remainder of my time. So it basically posits that there's some negative externality from immigrants in mass coming from poorer parts of the world to richer parts of the world that change our productivity in the first place. Now, the way they make the case, it's not well specified. It could be formal or informal institutions and norms. I've got a couple of quotes here from George Borjas. Him and Paul Collier are probably the two leading proponents of this argument. And here's the intuition behind it, though. This is the simple way to think about it. Cuba is poor because Cuba is socialist. Imagine that, well, you don't have to imagine. The institutions in Cuba are at least in part a reflection of the hearts, minds, beliefs, informal norms, formal things, history in Cuba. If we allow mass migration from Cuba to the United States, and those immigrants recreate Cuban institutions in Florida, not only will we not get the big economic gains in Florida that those standard economic models predict, but existing Floridians would become less productive because they would be living under a more socialist economic system. And that would dramatically shrink the gains from migration, or maybe even turn them negative. Now, I didn't pick the Cuban example by accident. I can think of no more solid anti-socialist voting group in the United States than Cuban immigrants in Florida. We'll come back to that in a minute. But that gives you the intuition of this argument. However, it's not just about socialism. It's people coming from Haiti, people coming from Nigeria, people coming from many countries that don't have an environment, both formal and informal. So this could be the economic freedoms of the country. This could be the rule of law in the country. This could be the level of corruption in the country, the level of political violence, any of these things that would disrupt us going about our ordinary activity in the marketplace where we create gains from others. And if they bring that with them, then these gains would disappear. And if that happens, then all of the other problems people bring up about mass migration become more important. Now, this is a theoretical problem of mass migration, but it's ultimately an empirical conjecture. And when George Borhaus writes his articles on this, he writes them with a lot of math, but no empirical evidence, and just posits that they might exist. Collier gives anecdotal examples. Myself and my co-author of the Wretched Refuse book, Alex Narasta, took these as a serious challenge to the case for open borders, which, if true, would significantly change how economists, or for that matter, libertarians, given this audience, should probably view mass migration. So that's what we're going to turn to examine. Now, it's called the new economic case for immigration restrictions, but it's not actually that new. What's new about it is the coupling of the fear of institutional change with the productivity that generates the massive economic. What's not new is the fear that immigrants will somehow destroy our freedoms or our culture. So this is from Thomas Jefferson, but you can find similar things from other founding fathers. So he says immigrants will bring with them the principles of the governments they leave, imbibe in their early youth, or if able to throw them off, it will be in exchange for an unbounded licentiousness, passing as is usual from one extreme to the other. It would be a miracle were they to stop precisely at the point of temperate liberty. That is essentially the fear that libertarians, conservatives, and those concerned with productivity and destination countries should have of immigrants coming. So here's the contribution Alex and I make with this. And we did it with a number of other co-authors across a series of research studies. And then Alex and I, who were the kind of the commonality across all these things, kind of each study addresses like one narrow point. And we tried to pull it together and say, what's the big picture when we look in the book on this Wretched Refuse? So we're going to have kind of two types of empirical examinations. One is cross-country econometric, basically statistical analysis with large numbers of countries, stocks and flows of immigrants, looking at their economic freedom, their corruption, their terrorism, how it impacts culture. And there's going to be limitations to all these. And then we're going to switch. We're going to say, all right, well, let's take a look at some mass migrations then of individual case studies in the United States when we had Ellis Island type immigration, and more recently in the 1990s in Israel and Jordan, where there were big migrant flows, 20% and 10% of the population respectively, and how the institutions in those countries responded to it. And then we're going to say, what kind of overall lessons can we get from this, and how should we think about this new empirical conjecture of how immigrants might impact institutions? So we're going to walk through these, and I know I've got a varied audience on here. I'm not going to overly tech you up on this stuff. I'll try to make it intuitive. There'll be some ugly tables. I'll walk you through it without getting too detailed and just give you the big picture of each of these. And we'll finish up in plenty of time to still have questions about the evidence. So first one, and this is probably most important to me as I'm looking at this, and probably for most of the audience of something called the Future of Freedom Foundation, most important to you who are watching this. Well, how does immigration impact our economic freedom in the destination countries? So what we did, and you see the map on the right, blue is economically free, green is next most, red is least free, not accidentally. And you see these different countries, and in general, countries that are blue and green are destination countries. Countries that are red and yellow tend to be origin countries where immigrants leave. There's a lot of research in the literature that shows lack of freedom at home pushes people to leave. Freedom in destination countries attracts more migrants. So then we're going to ask, how does that impact that freedom in the destination countries? Do the people from the low freedom origins bring some of that less freedom with them to the destinations? And the way we're going to do this is look at stocks and flows of immigrants. And these immigrant stocks go from essentially 0% of the population to nearly 80% of the population. And we're going to look over a 20-year period across 110 countries and say, do countries that have bigger stocks of immigrants or bigger inflows or bigger mixes between stocks and inflows, how does that impact the level of economic freedom 20 years later in a destination country? You can't do like 1 year on this because the changes in institutions of economic freedom evolve slowly over time. So what's the net effect over time? So this is an ugly table of statistical results. When you see little asterisks, it means things that matter. And then we want to look if we see negative or positive signs next to this. So I'm not going to walk you through all of this. I'm going to take you to the kind of headliner results here. We did this a whole bunch of different ways. This is just one example. So first up, line 2 is, look at that. I can even show you with my mouse here. Immigrant stock in 1990. What's its effect on economic freedom? 21 years later. And if the new economic case for immigration were true, we should have a negative sign here. Instead, it's positive. And those asterisks, when there's asterisks, it means it's statistically meaningful. Meaning, if we have more immigrants as a percent of our population across these 110 countries in 1990, over the next 20 years, we're more likely to improve our economic freedom even more. And when we separate it out from basically OECD countries, rich countries versus poor countries, it's actually immigrants from poor countries that have the positive effect. We can also look at the flow of immigrants that comes in. And that also, not negative, positive, again, statistically significant. As we continue across, we lose statistical significance here, but still says positive, but the flow is good. So what's happening? Punchline there is we look across a whole bunch of these. We do this 32 different ways. We don't find a single negative, basically the new case for economic restrictions, negative relationship that's statistically significant. We find mostly positive, and some, many, but not all, statistically meaningful as well. If we're going to try to quantify this, of like how much does it mean? A 1 standard deviation increase in the immigrant stock associated with about a third of a point higher economic freedom score. If we take that economic freedom score, which by the way measures size of government, security and property rights and legal system, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and level of regulation, those are the 5 big areas. We take that third of a point higher, plug it into growth regressions that look at the direct and indirect effects of economic freedom on growth. That translates into about a 0.5% higher annual economic growth rate. That seems meaningfully economically significant to me. Now, what the statistical relationship can't tell you by itself is like the mechanism. Why? What's the cause of it? But I've got some intuition on this. It's not accidental that I started with the story about Cuba. I think there's a selection bias of who chooses to immigrate. The people who leave their origin countries are not representative of the average beliefs in the origin country. They are outliers, and they tend to be attracted to countries that they like their institutions more. Cubans who flee Cuban socialism don't want to recreate Cuban socialism. They want to enjoy the freedoms of the United States and reinforce those. I think they're probably a particularly extreme example, but I think there's an element of this from immigrants from other origin countries to the United States and other destinations. And for the record, I'm sitting in my bar in Texas, Lubbock, Texas. In Texas, and by the way, I hate red and blue, especially 1 week before an election here as a way to measure ideology. But it's a measure that we have on this. But Texans worry about Californians moving here and turning the state purple or something like that. But when you actually look at the data, Californians who move to Texas vote Republican at a higher rate than native-born Texans do. They also own guns, actually non-native-born Texans also own guns at a higher rate than native-born Texans do. This tells me the people who are moving into Texas, Texas is kind of a thing. People self-select when they come here. If you're just escaping the high cost of living in California, New York, Massachusetts, where I came from, you've got 48 states that ain't Texas that you could choose to move to. When you choose Texas, you're kind of choosing a thing. It probably means you're self-selecting into liking that institution. I moved from Massachusetts. Not only did I not bring Massachusetts economic values, I run a group called the Free Market Institute here. I think there's an element of that going on with international migration as well. Next up, corruption. We do this exact same exercise. And we look and say, across a whole bunch of countries, 110 countries again, over a 20-year period, do immigrants from more corrupt countries bring corrupt values to their destination? And we do this same type of exercise. In general, we get no results. Sometimes we get statistically significant ones where they decrease corruption. We cut it a few different ways. We're also, instead of just looking at all immigrants, we look at them from poor countries, from more corrupt ones. We use a couple different ways of measuring this. But punchline is, no matter how we do it, we basically don't really get anything meaningful. Meaning, corruption in origin countries doesn't migrate with the immigrants to corrupt destination countries. What do I think is going on there? Well, it's not so much pre-assimilation as responding to economic intent. Well, part of it is, I suppose. So if you're someone who benefits corruption from in an origin country, you're less likely to move in the first place. If you're on the side of the corruption that's making you poorer, you're more likely to not like it and leave. But another big part of it is, if you come from a corrupt country where corruption pays, you engage in corrupt acts. When you go to a country where corruption doesn't pay, you tend to assimilate to the norm in the destination country. I remember going to graduate school with a woman from the Soviet Union, or from the former Soviet Union, and her coming in all flustered to class one day that she got pulled over by a police officer. And when she got pulled over for speeding, she simply held a $20 bill out the window. And you can imagine how he reacted to that. She said, "What, not enough?" and grabbed another 20. And I assure you, she never made that mistake. Again, what paid in the Soviet Union or the former Soviet Union did not pay in the United States, and you adjust behavior accordingly. We also look at terrorism. We do this a whole bunch of different ways. Basically, when you have more immigrants, do you have more terrorism? And punchline is no, but also just a little bit of intuition here. If you're an international terrorist, there's much cheaper ways to move than migrating. You use a tourist visa or some other way of doing it. But terrorism is completely unrelated to immigration, whether we measure it in attacks, injuries, deaths, whether we look at it from conflict-torn countries or Muslim majority conflicts. There's just no relationship. Basically, the big predictors of terrorism, if you're engaged in international conflict, or particularly if you have a civil war. We also look at this for culture. Now, culture is a little bit messy and can be measured lots of different ways. But what we care about in this context is not like whether you bring cultural food with you, whether it's Italians who bring Italian dishes to the United States or Californians who bring avocado toast to Texas and don't get in line at my barbecue restaurant. Instead, we're talking about culture as it impacts productivity in destination countries. So the argument's not that immigrants have no effect on culture. I think that would be silly. Culture is a spontaneous order, and as you evolve other people, it's going to evolve the culture. The question is, does it impact the culture in ways that make the destination country less productive? And to that, I think the answer is no. And we look kind of two ways, one very specific and one very general. Very specific is on social trust. So there's some literature that talks about when we have more social trust, we can have more economic productivity and growth because we need less formal contract, we can trust people more. Now, there's problems with the trust literature on this of trust to good institutions. It's not clear whether trust causes good institutions or good institutions get you more trust, but it's also obvious that they're substitutes for each other. When you can rely on the court system to enforce contracts as written, you don't need to be as trusting of other people. When the court systems are corrupt, well, then trust becomes more important. Except immigration is a move to places that generally have better formal institutions, which makes the social trust less important. You also have trust assimilation. And whether people have generalized trust or trust in institutions, immigrants actually tend to have more trust in the formal institutions and destination countries. Just don't think there's a bunch here. The other way we look at it is on what's the so-called deep roots of economic development. And instead of looking at a particular type of culture, this just throws it all kind of into a black box and says, well, it matters where you and your ancestors come from. So we're going to look at your state history, your agricultural history back in 1500, and where your population comes from. And did they have a lot of history with the state and settled out agriculture in 1500? And that's going to predict how productive you are today. And so a place like the United States actually has a high culture measure in this deep roots because a lot of the population comes from ancestors who had state and agricultural history in Western Europe. Other places have less of it. And the idea is that immigrants are coming from a lot of places that don't have these, quote, deep roots of economic development, and that could undermine the productivity of the culture of where they go. Now, it turns out when you just even looking at the basic papers on this, once you look at geography of landlocked in sub-Saharan Africa, that matters even more than the state history. So just moving people from those places, or allowing people, excuse me, to move from those places to destination countries would increase output. Also, China, India, and the United States are huge outliers. Now, any statistical study is going to have huge outliers, but when three of your most populous countries in the world are your outliers, maybe you have to worry about this, because maybe there's more to be learned from the relationship of state history in China, India, and the United States than there is of, say, Luxembourg. If you weight it by population, the results go away. I also think there's a deeper problem here of migration today involves mechanisms of self-selection of people moving to where they want to go. That's very different than the deep roots literature that has the slave trade and conquest as the main way that cultures were transported between places. So basically, don't think there's much here. However, here we go, the limits of our cross-country results. So all of these are large country studies that involve lots of different places. Their stocks of immigrants occluded over decades, but we still have to be worried about endogeneity, or that it's not just that immigrants improve institutions or don't harm them, maybe they're moving to places in anticipation of those places becoming better. Now, with the stocks of immigrants, that's probably less relevant than the flows, but it's still a concern. We do various statistical things to try to control for this, but it's still going to be there. But the other, and I think more important thing is cross-country data comes from existing stocks and flows. These come from managed migration policies of countries around the world today. These policies limit the quantity and control the mix. So maybe what we're picking up so far is not what would happen with mass migration, but only what happens within the realm of managed migration. So thinking about this, I can do a hand graph here of a relationship. You know, the new economic case for immigration restriction has no data. It just posits that eventually it'll be a negative relationship between greater immigration and some institutions related to productivity. What these cross-country studies can do is they can pick up the start of this. And what I'm saying is instead of a negative, it's a positive, but that doesn't tell you if the positive line keeps going, or there's just no data to speak of it in these cross-country studies of whether it turns over and eventually becomes. So what we're going to try to do next is look at examples of mass migration where the numbers are much bigger. But there's a limited number of these things that we can look at, and we'll try to learn what we can from those. So first is the United States under Ellis Island immigration policy. And I'm sure Jacob is thrilled to see Frederick Engels and Karl Marx on my slide. My guess is that everybody in this immigration series, I'm the only one who's going to have them on my slides and be quoting them favorably in a future Freedom Foundation lecture. So on this topic, I think Marx and Engels are better than Franklin and Jefferson. So there's letters between them in the late 19th century complaining about mass migration to the United States, limiting the success of the socialist movement in the United States. So it is the case that immigration brought socialist thinkers to the United States, but it also undermined the main mechanism that socialist movements were successful in undermining economic freedoms in European states. Namely, it limited unionization. When you have a continuous flow of immigrants in, getting different ethnic groups in, it limits the solidarity. It undermines the ability of the unions to promote socialism. It also makes the native born look less favorably on large welfare states. Blonde, blue-eyed Swedes might not mind subsidizing other blonde, blue-eyed Swedes, but the more heterogeneous your population, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, the less people tend to like subsidizing, quote, others. If we look at the history of the United States too, the growth of big government, it's negatively correlated federal and state expenditures and local tax rates with the size of the immigrant population. Now, this isn't fancy statistics. This is just a little quick look at it. But if you look at federal expenditures and the immigrant stock, or a measure of fractionalization, what you see is that actually the big growth of government. So if we think of 3 periods in economic history, in US history and migration, is founding till about 1922, mass migration, 1922 to 1965, our most closed, 1965 to current. And where's your biggest growth of government? It's in the most closed border part of that time. So prior to the closure in the 1920s, you had much smaller growth in government. Post 1965, you had smaller growth in government compared to what you did in the period in between. Now, this is the one that I think is interesting to talk about. And I will try to wrap up here in 10 minutes so that we can do more questions. But when I sent my first of these studies, the economic freedom across countries, to George Borjas, and he politely responded back, Professor Powell, that has all of the benefits and all of the drawbacks to any cross-country study. He's like, what I'd like to see is a large natural experiment of a mass migration and what it does to institutions. And as I'm reading the email, I'm like, well, Israel, like economists have used that mass migration as an exogenous shock to study how it impacts labor markets, housing prices, a whole bunch of things. Like just no one's done it on institutions. So quickly, I look at economic freedom stats, just raw numbers, but I'm like, this is totally a study that needs to be looked at. So what happens here is Israel has had, since its founding, basically, the law of return, which is instant citizenship for worldwide Jewish people, children and grandchildren of Jewish people, and their non-Jewish spouses. And it comes with instant citizenship when you get off the plane, the boat, or the car, with voting rights and access to the welfare state. And what makes it an exogenous shock is Israel didn't change this policy. It existed. And Israel was highly socialist for a time. And in 1990, what happens is Soviet emigration restrictions go. That's the change, not Israeli policy. And as a result, there's a mass outflow of people of ethnically Jewish heritage from the Soviet Union. And one of the few countries that they can go to en masse is Israel. As a result, the population of Israel from former Soviet Union citizens increases by 20% over the decade. And this is a population with a 70-year history of no political or economic freedoms. If they brought those Soviet values to Israel, it could make Israel much more socialist. So the obvious objection to using Israel as a case study is, well, dude, it's Israel. just a religious movement that's homogeneous. But these weren't religiously or culturally homogeneous. They weren't moving for some Zionist reason. Most of the people who came were secular. Very few of them were religious. Half of them wished to go somewhere else if it was feasible. They just chose Israel because that's where they could go. Only 14% claimed the Jewish language as a first language. 97% of them spoke Russian. They all thought Russian culture was important to keep. Many felt nostalgia from it. It was basically normal push motives. The one thing that makes it different than mass migrations from the third world to the first world is that their human capital was high. So they were similar to the middle class in Israel in terms of human capital, rather than low-skilled migration from the third world. That's what's more unique than the particular Israel angle of this. So what happens? If we just look at raw scores of economic freedom of the world, they improved by 45% in the 1990s. They went from 15% below to 12% above the global average, went from ranking 92nd to 45th in economic freedom. Look at all 4 or 5 areas of economic freedom. 4 of the 5 increased during this time. The only one that went down was size of government. But it's not because they changed institutions, it's because they were poorer than existing Israelis and qualified for the welfare state immediately. So transfer spending went up, which is one component of that, and that's pulled down the size of government score. As they integrated economically, that score recovered by a decade and a half later. So basically, they did not choose them to hurt the institutions for the worse, they actually improved them. This is a fancy statistical way to do a counterfactual. Basically, the world doesn't have many North and South Koreas where we can hold almost everything constant and say, hey, what's the difference between capitalism or socialism or something else? Those are natural experiments. So this is a quasi-experiment, and we basically create a weighted average of countries to mirror the outcome in economic freedom of Israel prior to the Soviet mass migration, and say, you sync those right up to the mass migration, and then you let it go free after that and say, what does this fake Israel that was constructed do versus the real one? And it coincides with what the raw data was telling you, is that the fake one doesn't improve the way the real one does, which gives you some sort of causal relationship where you can think that it's the immigrant flow that mattered. And more importantly, in this case, I can also give you we can skip these things. I can give you a mechanism for why. So between the left Labor Party and the more free market party, they were basically in balance at this time. And sometimes fancy statistics do something, but just reading what's happening is obvious. Like the Labor Party stopped using red in its political propaganda because they did not want to alienate the Soviet vote. Basically, the people fleeing a communist country did not want to recreate Soviet socialism. They wanted to rebel against a more socialistic Labor Party. They immediately participated in politics with their own party, but also became part of the ruling coalition government during this time when economic freedom was increased. Basically, they were politically active and anti-socialist. So they were not recreating the institutions of their origin country. Instead, they were pushing the origins of their destination country to become more capitalist. We also review a similar study in Jordan. Here it's about 10% of the population. And again, it's an exogenous shock of Gulf War I, allowing Kuwaiti Palestinian refugees to move back to Jordan, again with instant voting rights. And here they were excluded from the kind of crony government system, and instead cared more about free enterprise and pushed for economic reform. In Jordan, doing the similar type of exercise, they go from the economic freedom of basically a Middle Eastern country to one of a normal OECD country. Now, there's limitations to each of these case studies too. In the United States case, comes from the 19th and early 20th century. Communication and travel were more difficult. Generally, there was a smaller role of government. Israel and Jordan, they're both kind of unique mass migrations that didn't apply to all immigrants. And most obviously, like Israel, if they had open migration with all of the Middle East, they would soon cease to be Israel, if that's not obvious from what's going on there today. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't have mass migration from the former Soviet Union, or for that matter today, from many Latin American countries who pose them no existential harm the way that other Middle Eastern countries. Limitations to all of these, though, instead of the endogeneity and small migration concerns that are the limitation of the cross-country studies, instead it's like how generalizable are these mass case studies to other places. So there's still limitations on it. So what do we get for the overall assessment here? Like the new economic case for immigration restrictions, it's an empirical claim and it requires empirical evidence. Thus far, people have not provided. Alex and I did our best to investigate and find. In fact, my favorite review of the book was in The Economist, and they said something to the effect of Powell and Narasta assess this as best they can. And I kind of laughed like, yeah, it was as best I could. We don't find it. But there's no QED here. There can be bilateral cases where the externality does exist. Now, if so, though, I think people jump to the conclusion whenever they find anything negative on migration of, therefore we close the border, or therefore we can't have a mass migration. I would think that we'd treat this more like international trade. So these aren't my favorite policies, but I just want to play with an idea here, because if I didn't care about the empirical result, well, then I've just got an ideology looking for a reason. I think if there were massive negative productivity shots on destination countries, or if immigrants really came and destroyed our freedoms, there'd be reasons for both people who care about prosperity and people who care about freedom, like libertarians, to oppose mass migration. But how would you deal with it if you found these things and it's not just a general? I would think it's kind of like a national defense exemption in free trade. So like free trade is generally beneficial if you find one particular product in one particular country in one particular place where for national defense reasons they have to protect it. Well, that's a special case. It doesn't mean that therefore they should have trade restrictions on all other goods, nor does it mean all other countries should have trade restrictions on that good. It's a rare exception that is applied in a particular circumstance. So I would think about the same on migration. So I don't think there's any evidence of this negative externality now, but let's say for the sake of argument, if we look, we have mass migration flows from Latin America to the United States and from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe. But we have relatively modest flows from North Africa and Middle East to the United States and from Latin America to Europe. So let's imagine we do start seeing such a negative externality from migration that's decreasing our freedom or productivity in either place. Well, that the United States would need to quantitatively or qualitatively limit the migration from Latin America, and Europe would have to do so from Middle East, North Africa. But meanwhile, the other region, the United States, could take as many as it wanted still from Middle East, North Africa. Europe could take more from Latin America. And the global gains from mass migration would be essentially the same, a little bit different, but not hugely different compared to closing borders. These are ways that I'd play with the idea versus just saying, oh, there's some evidence in one case, so we should just close the border. I don't think that falls. Now, I think if you tried to implement that policy, immigration protectionist, would abuse this for a whole host of reasons. So it might be like a Pandora's box that's not worth investigating, but I at least have to play with the possibility of if the empirical evidence started going a different way in particular cases, how should we think about dealing with it? And I don't think the answer is just general closures of borders. So I will wrap up there with 15 minutes to go so that I can more easily smoke this cigar while some of you put in questions to Jacob, and then I can try to deal with those.
Okay.
So thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Absolutely fantastic presentation. And we're very appreciative. And we got a couple of questions here. I got a couple of questions too. If you have a question, go ahead and do it in the Q&A section. So somebody is asking about your books. Can you reiterate your two books mentioned in the pre-show? Socialism Sucks and some second book on immigration.
Sure. So one of these things is not like the others in Sesame Street. Bob Lawson and I wrote a book a few years ago called Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World. And it's a firsthand Anthony Bourdain-style travel log, except replaced food with socialist economics and the history and functioning of these systems. And we use alcohol as a metaphor for how these economies function as well, and have a good time while we do it. So a talk like this would be very much in the spirit of that book. And it does not have any statistical tables, but it is based on sound social science. But this is a bit different style read. And the other one, the first book I did on immigration was an edited volume, The Economics of Immigration, Social Science, Public Policy, and some other shit. That one is an edited volume that tries in the first half of the book to bring together people writing on the best social science of economic impacts, fiscal impacts, other impacts of immigration. And in the second half of the book, people who appreciate that social science but differ in their policy views of what the right immigration policy is, because the motivation for that one was basically how social scientists disagree is very different from how the general public disagrees. So a guy like George Borjas, who is a very talented economist and a big critic of immigration, when he says we should have less immigration to the United States, he doesn't say it's because they're going to impoverish us. It's going to be, well, it doesn't make the native born that much more wealthy, so we could easily get rid of it, and there's other benefits to getting it. And he doesn't say it destroys our wages. It's like the debate among economists is, do the least skilled, like high school dropouts, lose no wages or up to 8% of their wages for up to a period of 2 years, or not at all? Like, these are how we debate it, which is way different than what you see in public discourse. So it's trying to get the social science dialed in, and then still seeing how respectable social scientists disagree about policy.
Okay, and what about the Wretched Refuse book?
Well, that's the one I just did.
I'm sorry?
The Wretched Refuse, Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions is mostly.
Oh, is that the one you were talking about? Okay, that was.
But
okay.
I tried to do a shitty enough job that people would still buy the book because there's more in there than what I could say.
Okay, and this person wants to point out that she or he is going to buy your books despite the fact that Texas Tech beat University UNT Mean Green earlier in this season. She won't hold that against you.
Well,
okay.
Thank you. If people just want to buy my books who beat Texas Tech, there's plenty of them around too.
Okay, next question. Do you believe that the historical results from your examples will be true of what's going on now in the United States, since much of the mass migration here is illegal?
So, I think so, yes. But I think the best solution for illegal immigration is legal immigration. So a lot of people point out, like, oh, my ancestors came here legally, they should get in line and come legally too. The fact of the matter is there's no line for most of the world's poor. So unless you're a high-skilled person or you have a close family member already in the United States, you have virtually no legal path to immigration to the United States. And when you have productivity differences that we do between near neighbors in Latin America and us, you are going to have illegal immigration regardless of border enforcement, unless we create legal paths where they can plausibly get in. And this is why I defend Ellis Island immigration. But even if you don't want to go that far, I think drastically opening up low-skill immigration in a legal path that gets people here eventually would do a lot to stem the flow of illegal immigration. But those people are coming for the same reasons: economic opportunity and not hatred of the United States. So I think, and in fact, in some ways, they're more entrepreneurial risk takers since they're coming here illegal. I would like to see greater legal paths for all of them.
All right, but the related question that we're always hitting this area is, okay, you mentioned Texas and California and people flooding into Texas from California. No one ever seems to worry about the fact that the entire nation of 333 million people might suddenly move to Austin, Texas. But we do hear the fear that the whole world might move to the United States, a billion people overnight and so forth, if we had even an Ellis Island kind of system. Can you address that?
Yeah, so that the more rapidly immigration comes, the more difficult the transition in terms of crowding, slumming, things like that. Global inequality decreases, observed inequality increases, because frankly, most of us in the United States, myself not being one of them, don't spend very much time in poorer parts of the world and see the poverty that's there. So poverty would be more real. It'd be less pervasive, but more observed by most Americans, and that would be difficult. But if this is your real hang up on it, let's triple immigration quotas right now and keep it up year after year after year and let the flow come in. You don't have to let an entire billion people in overnight. I also don't think it would happen as an entire billion people overnight. There's still, even in the world of technological communication and airfare and stuff today, there's still limitations, natural limitations that would slow the flow.
All right. And on the cultural issue, would you address I mean, it's sort of a self-evident point, but that the first generation obviously comes in heavily influenced by where they were brought up and raised and worked and so forth. But that sometimes changes with the next generation and the next generation, right?
Yeah, they assimilate, and I think that's our problem because they assimilate to the welfare status norm of culture in America. So instead, what we need is the melting pot culture of the 19th century, where we said become Americans and stand on your own goddamn 2 feet. And instead, what too many people do in the United States today is want to accommodate a lack of assimilation and tax fund benefits for these people. I think they assimilate too well to the same rot that our own children get in schools in the United States.
Yeah, my experience has been that the second generation will learn the native language. The parents are pretty conscientious about speaking the native language at home and letting them pick up English as a secondary language. But by the time the third generation comes along, they don't have any knowledge of that native language hardly at all.
Okay, so that aspect of it is different. So I think that's important, and you're right. Jake Vigdor is the economist to look at some of his work on this, on assimilation. And he creates the assimilation index of looking at language acquisition, intermarriage rate, and military service, and how easy it is to distinguish immigrants from native-born population over time, both the immigrants and generations that come behind. It basically finds immigrants today assimilate a lot on those margins, like immigrants in the past. And part of this on language, by the way, is diaspora dynamics, right? If you move to the United States today and you speak Swahili, you're gonna language assimilate really quick because there's no one to freaking talk to in Swahili. If you move from a Spanish-speaking country, well, then the benefits of speaking English relative to just speaking Spanish are lower, so you don't have to assimilate as quick. So what we've seen in the past, going back hundreds of years and currently, is these migrant waves, and they get bigger over time and they assimilate less well language-wise, if we think that's important, as they get bigger. But then the new country starts popping up, and all of a sudden they're assimilating more quickly, and then the same thing reverses. It's funny, almost all objections you hear about cultural assimilation of migrants today, you can find about the swarthy Germans, if it's Ben Franklin, about the redheaded Irish, about the Italians. These things aren't new. Our data is just not as good on the earlier immigration waves on some of this. But I'd encourage people who care about that to look at Jake Vigdor's work.
Well, I grew up in Laredo, Texas, which was in the disputed zone south of the Nueces River that Mexico was claiming even after the Texas Revolution. And It was ultimately absorbed in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So you can imagine what the population was like and the culture in Laredo, that when I'd go for jury trials, I was a lawyer in my early days, about 20 to 25% of the jury panel could not speak or write English. And nobody cared. It was like the judge was very courteous. Oh, thank you for your service. You'll get your check. You're excused. And nobody cared. And I would say probably about at least half of the daily conversations in Laredo are still in Spanish. People are bilingual. Nobody cares. It's like, it's part of the culture.
So, I mean, I think with some immigration waves, this is going to be a difference. Like I said, culture is a spontaneous order, and it's going to evolve, including linguistically. And, economics is a science of trade-offs. And a part of the trade-off is we like double global GDP, but we have more bilingual discourse. And you're someone who's like, let's not allow doubling of global GDP because I want to not push two for Spanish. That's kind of messed up. Economics doesn't tell you that, but I think morally I feel that way. But by the way, you bring up the Texas, and some people will bring up to me sometimes in this the Texas Revolution of these. The Americans were moving into Texas, and look what they did. They tore it away from Mexico. Isn't that a counterexample to you? And there's kind of two responses. One is actually there were tons of revolutions in Mexico at that time trying to break away from an overreaching federal government. The only one that was successful was Texas. So it wasn't just the story of the Americans not wanting to be Mexican. But two, it actually still fits with my story. It's not that there's no institutional change. It was a pro-freedom change. Texas is better today because it's not part of Mexico.
Well, and it was a revolt against the central government and the centralization of power in Mexico City, which ironically, a lot of Americans, including a lot of Texans, favor today. Big central government in Washington, D.C. But Laredo is part of what you were just talking about. It was called the Republic of the Rio Grande, and they revolted too. It wasn't just Texas. They revolted, and Laredo was the capital. Unfortunately, Santa Anna was able to quell that one, unable to quell the one further north, but he did quell Laredo's, the Republic of the Rio Grande. We've got 4 more minutes, and we got one more question here. Turkish immigrants in Germany are still second-class citizens, even after generations of immigration. It could be good for the country that accepts the immigrants, but is it always good for the immigrants if the host country doesn't accept them?
So a large number of immigrants also return to their origin countries. In the United States during mass migration, I think it was something in the order of, and this is when travel was hard, close to 1 out of 3 returned. So it's not always good for them, but as long as they're free to go back, people are free to choose and experiment. But I want to take this opportunity, not so much for the ones who have been there for generations in Germany, but for the European context versus the American context, particularly as it relates to this institutional part of it. Mass migration in Europe is a lot harder than it is in the United States. Some of this is cultural, historical, we're a nation of immigrants, they're a different batch. But I actually think a lot of it is economic institutions. So in Europe, various refugees sometimes don't have permission to work. You also have high minimum wages relative to productivity, and you have very hard worker dismissal laws where you can't fire a worker once you hire them without big cost. So imagine in order to go on a date, you have to first marry somebody with no possibility of divorce. Welcome to being a French employer hiring somebody. And when you do these things, you only hire well-known people who are from your culture, who are more work experience. So that's why youth unemployment is low, but it also makes it really hard to integrate immigrants economically. And when you don't integrate them economically, they enclave and look to themselves. They resent the society that's hosting them. The society resents them back, and you get in this awful feedback loop. We have much less of that in the United States than Europe does. And I think a lot of it has to do with our labor market policies that better integrate economically. Although still, in this latest refugee wave that we've seen in the United States, with people being flown up to Massachusetts and other places and being not working but put up on state sanctioned things in New York and other places, I think that's bad for the overall cultural assimilation. Instead, we should be telling them, here, get a job, integrate economically, and then culturally, it'll better take care of itself if we do it like that.
Great answer. Let me have one last question here. What are your thoughts on Cuban refugees to the United States? Why don't popular immigration groups with powerful allies in government affect attitudes towards other less popular groups?
I'm not sure about the last question, although this is a heated issue that tends to play to people's emotions rather than sensibilities. But I will say that I think as America, a land of the free, for people escaping socialist countries who hate socialism, we should be a welcoming place. That includes Cubans, Venezuelans, and I think one of the more egregious episodes that should have been a no-brainer a couple of years ago is when China passed its national security law on Hong Kong, and you had Hong Kongers. The British allowed people there who had the British overseas passport prior to 1997 to freely migrate to Britain. That was an opportunity for us. High educated, high skilled people who love freedom in Hong Kong That's a no-brainer. Give them visas to the United States. They're going to enhance our institutions and enrich us economically. And the United States government didn't do that. We should be picking up the low-hanging fruit. I've been arguing we should pick up the higher fruit too. But stuff like that, we should be doing as a land of the free.
Ben, absolutely fantastic presentation. It's everything I wanted here is in trying to collect this fantastic group of presentations on open borders or Ellis Island system. And I'm just, I'm very, very honored and pleased that you took the time to do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacob. Always appreciate you.
All right, and next week we got Don Boudreau, former president of the Foundation for Economic Education, currently and has been for quite a while now, professor of economics at George Mason University, which is right there ranking with Texas Tech in terms of free market Austrian economics. I'm certain you're going to thoroughly enjoy Don. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next week.